Welcome to the Cinematologist podcast. I'm Dario and of course down the line I have my good friend Neil Fox. Neil, how are you?
I'm very well. It's lovely to talk to you. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. Good to talk to you. This is our last show of the series, and a big subject that we're going to get into for this episode, Tokyo Story, Ozu, something I've wanted to talk about for a long time. And we've talked a little bit, haven't we, about how to space out the types of episodes that we're doing. And, we talked a lot this series about bringing in, maybe films that people haven't seen and different voices, because it seems that fits the time, but always going back to films that are kind of formative. I mean, I think obviously formative for many people, but, I'd put that up there as a film that sort of got me invested in the different types of styles and forms and ideas that cinema can bring.
Great stuff. Yeah, I mean, as we sort of talked a long time ago on the podcast about the kind of the gaps, this was, Ozu was definitely a gap of mine when we started the podcast, and I'd seen Tokyo Story, but that was it really. So over the last couple of years, I've really kind of got into his back catalogue, and it's been really interesting, and sort of, lots to talk about with him, and also the film and kind of where it sits in his filmography, but also kind of wider film culture. And that's going to lead us on to some more other conversations about kind of Japanese cinema in general as part of our focus on Japan with our BFI partnership, which is still ongoing, albeit slightly changed given the circumstances.
Yeah, what have you thought of the overall availability now of all of these Japanese titles on the BFI player? I mean, to be honest with you, I've sort of been spoilt for choice, and it's been a little difficult, what with everything else going on, to find a kind of structure of the way to approach the amount of content that's on there. I mean, there's a couple of directors that I definitely wanted to see some work of, but I think now, there's a little bit more time in the next couple of months. I'll definitely be able to get into looking at work that maybe, as you say, sort of fills the gaps of things I haven't seen. Yeah,
it's strange. I think I was sent the new BFI release, 3-disc release of Takeshi Kitano, so that's where a lot of my focus has been on his work, sort of revisiting and sort of visiting some of that. But also weirdly, kind of the timing wise, on Amazon Prime, there's a load of Ishiro Honda monster movies, so it feels like a boon time for kind of Japanese cinema, but it's always been one of the more readily available kind of national cinemas, certainly on kind of DVD, both historically and contemporary, in terms of filmmakers like Takeshi Miike and Kitano and things like that. So it's interesting to know what to really look at. And obviously as well, episodes like this are generally structured based on the kind of the partners that we end up working with, and the kind of focus of the films that get picked for being looked at. So having a complete history of a country at your fingertips to decide what to focus on is kind of both a kind of a blessing and a curse. But I think that the discussions we had that you sort of said about, when we knew that the BFI were re-releasing Tokyo Story, as kind of getting to grips with that, I think is a kind of good place to start, because it's such a big film in terms of Japanese film culture, but also it leads to important questions about how that communicates what Japanese cinema might be historically and now that we can kind of get into.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll come on to this, but it is one of those films that I think is pointed to by directors as, a sort of masterclass in direction. And I think one of the things obviously we're going to talk about is why that is the case, because it's an interesting film in terms of, if you put this in front of a quote-unquote lay audience, would they see anything, mesmerizing or magical or canonical or masterful about it? I mean, that's a really interesting question, I think. But before we get into that, you've got a few films that you want to talk about, which are Bela Lugosi films, ostensibly, that you've been sent.
Yes, although I'll get into that, whether they are actually Bela Lugosi films. So Masters of Cinema are releasing a trilogy of Bela Lugosi starring Edgar Allan Poe adaptations. They've got Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Black Cat and The Raven, all sort of from the early 30s, post-Dracula Universal horror. They're very much B-movie horrors in that kind of early 30s period. And it's just a lovely set, really, really fun movies. Two of them are also Boris Karloff movies.
Right.
So that's why I'm not sure that it's a trilogy of kind of Lugosi movies, because the Black Cat and the Raven, they both kind of co-star, but on the credits, it's Boris is given the top billing.
Sure.
In a way that just must have really annoyed Lugosi, because it's just Karloff in these huge caps. He's the top star, not even Boris Karloff, just Karloff, like you know who it is. And then underneath that, it's Bela Lugosi. And it was hard to watch the films without thinking of Ed Wood and Martin Landau's performance, famously yelling, "Karloff doesn't deserve to smell my shit," which is one of my favourite line readings. But you they're just so different. You know, watching Karloff his presence is just astounding. He doesn't have to do very much. And Lugosi's great fun, but he's kind of always working hard, particularly when he's up against Boris Karloff. So they're great fun movies, but yeah, kind of interesting that they've been packaged as Lugosi films. Hopefully to see them in that light, to see what he was doing sort of out of the shadow of Karloff, his kind of great nemesis. But the one thing I did want to, what I think they're really great films to watch for is this kind of early 30s expressionism that kind of came out of, obviously, German expressionism that Universal horror movies were kind of really mining, particularly the second in the series, which is the Black Cat, which the sets are just absolutely phenomenal, and they really add a kind of atmosphere which is kind of central to the Poe unease which runs through them. And there's a great King Kong ending of the first one, Murders in the Rue Morgue. Yeah, Lugosi plays this scientist who's kind of got this gorilla that he's humanizing, and it becomes a kind of King Kong parody at the end. So lots of fun, and just made me want to sort of seek out Ed Wood again. But that's a really nice set.
Brilliant. That sounds well worth visiting if you can do that. So before we actually get directly into Tokyo Story, we wanted to sort of give a few highlights of some of the BFI films in the Japan season that we'd watched, and then we can get into Tokyo Story more directly. And I think that there's a possibility we're going to do another Japan episode, maybe on again a much lesser known film, but it was great to be able to catch up with High and Low. And I felt when you mentioned this on your newsletter, I think it was recommendations, or we talked about it at some point, and as being sort of classical Kurosawa, and I was like, shit, I haven't seen that. I better get to it, and really interesting sort of setup in terms of this businessman who has a son kidnapped, and it reminded me a little bit of Parasite in that sense.
Yeah.
And the sort of relationship between him, the main, which is played by Toshihiro Mifune, who's the way he treats the servant whose kid gets kidnapped by mistake, and it becomes this sort of. It's funny how it sort of starts off as this sort of social commentary at the beginning, and then turns into a sort of procedural, almost sort of Mission Impossible type territory. With that train sequence, which are just unbelievably entertaining movie, and it's so good, isn't it, when you watch a film that's sort of that old and you're still just riveted by how entertaining it is.
Yeah, and proof of what a great kind of genre filmmaker Kurosawa was. Yeah, that I think that came out when I watched that Johnny Toe judo movie.
Oh yeah, that was it.
We were talking about that. Yeah. That was High and Low. I mean, it's it's a stupid thing to say they're underrated, but certainly his kind of urban kind of crime movies are seen to be lesser regarded than the kind of the big samurai epics that he's known for. So and I think that kind of speaks to some of the stuff I've been watching as well, which is the Kitano movies. I think they're very much indebted to that kind of cinema as well.
Yeah, for sure.
What else have you been seeing?
And the other one I kind of definitely wanted to catch up with is I've seen so far a couple of Mikio Naruse films, and this is a director that was a sort of blind spot. I'd heard of him, and I knew that he was, if the big three are Mizoguchi, Ozu, and Kurosawa, then Naruse was the sort of forgotten fourth, as it were. And I know that's crude, but you get the gist of it. And I just really interested to see where he would sit in terms of the form of those other directors. And I think he's very much kind of like more towards Ozu, but with a more populist, Americanized flavor. He's not sort of abashedly, formulating his own system of filmmaking, his own complete personal style. And there's lots of elements to the films that I saw. I mean, the two films that I saw, two of his most famous ones, Floating Clouds and When a Woman Ascends the Stairs. And what's interesting is that both of them put the experience of women at the heart of the movies. That they revolve around women's position in Japanese society post-war, and how there's a sort of, the tradition is something that was, I think, Japanese women wanted to leave behind, but there was nothing to kind of go to. So a lot the characters in the movies get caught between adopting a kind of westernized lifestyle and kind of being judged for that, or just getting married off and becoming subservient to Japanese patriarchs and kind of being judged for that too. So there's sort of no place for secure place for Japanese femininity to exist post-war. You know, if you look at the way that these films are represented, and they're really made, both of them, by the central performance of Hideko Takamine, who was absolutely astonishing. Again, a face that I'd known, somebody who had a really long career, was a child actress and had made a lot of films with Naruse. And, you know, I know it's really sort of crass to make Western comparisons, but I was trying to think of the sort of style of actor that would be of a parallel, just to give you a sense of the way I was thinking. And the closest thing I could come up with was something like a performance like Cate Blanchett in the Todd Haynes movies, you know, in Carol particularly, where she's very still and the face is very still and only sort of moves and gestures when absolutely necessary, and everything is in the eyes and in the muscles of the face. You know, there's those moments where you can tell somebody's thinking or there's an emotion, and there's just little twitches and movements here and there. And yeah, really, really amazing performance. And I think Naruse's films almost reminded me of the sort of 50s work of Weiler, to be honest with you, in many ways, in the ways that the plot is set up and the music kind of feeds into pushing the story in certain directions. Yeah, really, really interesting work.
Great. Yeah, look forward to catching that over the summer. Yeah, nice.
What about you?
Yeah, so I've been deep in the nihilism of Takeshi Kitano. I've seen sort of four films in the last week, and the three that the BFI are re-releasing are Violent Cop, Boiling Point, and Sonatine from the early 90s. All kind of Yakuza based, although Violent Cop, he plays a cop kind of out to sort of take down some Yakuza, and then he is a kind of Yakuza in Boiling Point and Sonatine. And I got into Kitano in the late 90s with Hanabi Fireworks, which I also rewatched, which I absolutely adore. But it was really interesting to watch the earlier films, sort of rewatch Boiling Point and Sonatine, which I'd seen a long time ago, and sort of see the progression. And what's amazing about his cinema is that it's so bleak and it's so nihilist, and it's really, you know, downbeat in terms of the tone and the stories, but the filmmaking is so vibrant and vivacious, you know, and it's this kind of real interesting juxtaposition of color and, you know, kind of style against just these characters fatalistically marching towards death, you know, in kind of all situations. It's really, really striking. And the Western comparison, you sort of talking about the kind of the crude Western comparisons, but I think what's interesting is it is a cinema that feels very much to me like Jean-Pierre Melville's. You know, you're seeing a national crime cinema through a kind of American B-movie lens, you know, and kind of using those codes and conventions and styles to access something, and it's really fascinating. And just thinking of him in a 90s context, watching those films back to back was like, okay, he is a clear contemporary of the Coens. He's doing something very, very similar in terms of humor, and very, very dark humor, real bleak violence, and this kind of nihilistic, kind of cynical tone. But what was really interesting was that the filmmaker that it reminded me most of was Wes Anderson, and realizing how much Wes Anderson takes a lot of the beats, excuse the pun, from Kitano cinema, particularly his use of direct address, operatic music, and kind of these really still images. And he does a lot of these kind of sequences, which is a really slow signposting prelude. So you sort of see the beginning of something that you just know is going to go badly and how it's going to go badly. And then it cuts to the inevitable aftermath. You know, it misses out the vital moment, and you just see the inevitable disappointment or the inevitable kind of outcome of the stupidity that you've been sort of spending time building up to. Really interesting kind of visual motifs that were similar. And I've never really got on with Boiling Point as a film. It feels a bit too weird, but I hadn't seen Violent Cop, and it was absolutely, yeah, kind of exhilarating in its darkness. It's just really, the films I recalled were like the work of Don Siegel and John Borman's Point Blank, with an incredibly shocking ending, like really, really shocking ending. But there's an acceptance and a kind of moving towards the darkness in those films, which by the time you get to Hana-bi, which is a much more interesting multi-tonal film, there's just a more melancholy kind of undercurrent to it. You know, that it's almost as if Kitano as a character in all of these things has been worn down and is just, yeah, kind of more resigned, less kind of facing up to the inevitable end with a fierceness, and it's more just trudging towards. Really interesting. But there is a little bit of hope in that film as opposed to the others, which are much more
yeah,
more
I mean, it's interesting that, isn't it? Because if you think of, you know, the way that directors sort of change over time, and maybe there's a sort of sense in which that kind of nihilism, you know, it works when you're young and you're full of energy, and there's a sort of rebelliousness and, you know, a rage against whatever it might be, that anything that stands for, you know, the mainstream or whatever it is that actually fuels that kind of sensibility where you want to really sort of push the boundaries. It's funny how that doesn't answer the questions that you want answering when you get a little bit older.
Yeah, but I think you're absolutely right. But I think that in the case of Kitano, there's no sense that there will be answers, but just that, and it's because suicide plays a big part in those films, and it changes between a defiant, "You'll never take me alive" copper kind of James Cagney to the end of the road. You know, what else is there? And it's between Violent Cop and Hana-bi, it's only maybe 8 years.
Yeah.
But it feels like a lifetime in terms of watching that character constantly going up against the system and the Yakuza, and always just realizing it's never going to change. You know, and then there's other things in Hana-bi in terms of his backstory, which just adds so much darkness to it. But yeah, I think it's such a clear change, like you say, from a youthful approach to that to a kind of slightly older, very much more worn down. And it did make me think about how the treatment of subjects kind of changes across the director's career. You know, often talk about late period, and we might get into that with Ozu as well. You know, like how does their treatment of their core interests change across a body of work? I think is fascinating. So yeah, all great, interesting movies, really. The other thing I sort of mentioned it earlier, was Honda's monster movies on Amazon Prime, like Dogora and Mothra, and I've got lined up King Kong versus Godzilla. I mean, they're great fun, super trashy, but no less interested in post-war Japan and the aftermath of World War II and Japanese society rebuilding and being part of the world after that seismic event. And it's so fascinating to see Tokyo Story and then Mothra, but also feel that these are filmmakers who are aware of the changing Japanese society, and just great fun. Well worth checking out if you've got the horrible Amazon, you know. But there's a lot of good stuff on there at the moment.
Yeah,
so
I mean, it's one of those things, isn't it?
It is.
Nothing's perfect in life, as we know, and it's you've got to sort of reconcile the fact that you have to deal with these corporations, unfortunately.
I know, and then you just think, oh, you know, maybe I will step away. And then the other day they dropped like 10 Yasujirö movies. Yeah, and you're just like, oh god.
Yeah.
And I know that that's part of their MO, you know, kind of keeping you on tenterhooks. But really, it's a good place to catch up with older kind of movies that maybe aren't necessarily as readily available.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's not. You know, you got to give them props because it's not happening anywhere else. I mean, you know, people like ourselves who have access to libraries and stuff, or we used to when we could go into physical spaces. You know what I mean? It's much easier, but it is difficult to see this stuff generally. Yeah. And I think now, in the last couple of months, there's definitely been a move, I think, or a realization that back catalogues are going to have to be utilized.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be the kind of the content that's the easiest to kind of get out into the world and get people to see. And just as a note on that, I saw Hana-bi on the Movie Library, which is the first film I'd watched on there.
Oh right.
They got 3 of Kitano's movies on there at the moment, including Kids Return and Yasujirö, from around the same period, that sort of mid-90s period.
Yeah, I mean, I'll have to check all those out because I haven't seen any, apart from Boiling Point and a couple of others that I think I've seen Hannah B. But again, it's another sort of blind spot that could do with covering it a little bit. But I mean, maybe that's the way to approach it. It is just sort of a directorial thing. You say, okay, I'm going to see a good chunk of, like, going through all the Melville stuff was just great when they were coming out.
But I think that's good in terms of like those kind of gatekeepers and like the BFI kind of choosing certain titles to push. It does help at least focus the watching at the start, and then obviously you've done Naruse, so now I'm thinking, okay, yeah, I can go there next, and then that gives us something to talk about. This the process is kind of interesting, and you do need the likes of the BFI movies sometimes to kind of remind you of the roads that are available to you, I think.
So I guess that brings us on to the main meat of the podcast, Tokyo Story. So, I mean, again, we've, as I said at the beginning of the show, we've kind of had discussions, haven't we, quite a lot, maybe over the last year, about what do we do when it comes to these monuments of cinema that people I don't think generally people are wanting to reject them or get rid of them, in the same way that they're throwing statues into the river. But there's definitely a sense that we have to look beyond them. And yes, we can sort of appreciate what they are and what they've done for cinema. But even the selection of, say, Tokyo Story and Citizen Kane and Vertigo and Passion of Joan of Arc, these things are, if they're reiterated all the time, then it does create a kind of foregone conclusion as to what cinema history should look like. So, I mean, it's just interesting as a starting point. If that's the starting point, then why go back to a film like this?
Yeah, it's really interesting to me in terms of thinking about what gets selected as the best films from a filmmaker's filmography. One of the questions I put on there on the notes for this episode was, are the best films people's favorites? Like, if you were to ask me my favorite Ozu movie, it would be Floating Weeds.
Yeah.
And when I watch Tokyo Story, I can see why it's important, in the same way that, you can stand in front of a masterpiece in a museum where you can like read a kind of classic text and you can see formally and in terms of the subject, in terms of the dealing with the material, why it's given that space. And so many of those titles that you sort of mentioned there, like Citizen Kane and Vertigo, feel important, but they don't necessarily indicate the breadth of a filmmaker's work or even a kind of wide appreciation for, like you say, cinema. And they're all very serious films. They're very earnest films, even as formally interesting as they are. They're all focused on a very important and weighty and sort of stately subject. I think that's kind of maybe changing, but it certainly feels like there are films that you should say you think are the best, and Tokyo Story is one of them. And rewatching it the other day, I was like, this is a really great film, but I would not go back to this film if I was in the mood for an Ozu and wanted to sort of, because it feels very rigid and very, in a way that some of his other work just doesn't. It feels like I'm engaging with an important work of art, but it's more interesting to me as a gateway to other things. And it's hard to say why and how we've got to that position, and I think, like you say, there's been a repetition of those titles, which maybe comes out of a kind of fear of wanting to say, well, actually, what about this? It's kind of a common agreement. Well, if you all say Tokyo Story, that's Ozu and that period of Japanese cinema covered.
Yeah, I tend to think that there is maybe something in between that notion of best and favourite. And that, to me, relates to the hangover or the continued influence of auteur theory, which is the films that are the quintessential distillation of what that filmmaker represents. So, you could say that with Citizen Kane, you can say that with Vertigo and with Tokyo Story, I think, particularly because it does that thing of stripping away anything extraneous to what would be considered Ozu's key thematic and stylistic interests. And he doesn't allow the, like you say on your notes there, he doesn't sort of bring in any like little kids doing something silly, which, you know, Floating Weeds has, and a lot of his other films sort of revolve a little bit more around. There's a little bit of a, you know, a break of a humorous aside to take you along. You know what I mean? And I think the importance of this does revolve around that, particularly in the way that from the beginning it doesn't sort of point you in any directions. I don't think it just lays out what is going on with these characters and requires you, more than any other film I think that I can think of, to come to it and fill in all of the repressions and the things that are not said with your own universalist understandings of what the relationship between these characters are in the situation that they're in.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. What's interesting though is, like, when I first saw it, it didn't make me want to investigate any more of his work, you know, because it, not necessarily because it was presented as important, but because the treatment felt very serious and very earnest. And at the time, you know, the time, and still, you know, it didn't feel like there was a looseness to it. It felt, I was like, okay, but only in the sense of like, oh, okay, I get what this filmmaker's about from this, you know, because it's such, like you say, it's such a kind of distillation of, and you're guided towards it to say, like, this is the example, you know, this is such a kind of good example of this style. It felt like, okay, I don't know if I want to see many more films like that. And of course, his films are very different a lot of the time, which obviously you learn is the case for most auteurs. You know, if you really kind of spend time with their work, you realize kind of what is presented as their style is much more complex than that. I think that's something I've definitely learned the more time I've spent with cinema, is not to assume that Tokyo Story is Ozu, although it is a very, very wonderful kind of crib sheet on his way of looking at the world and his kind of his style of filmmaking.
So in terms of the plot, or the story, it's pretty basic. You've got two grandparents who are visiting Tokyo to visit their family. There isn't really much more to say than that, is there? It's Shukichi is the father and Tommy is the wife, and it's funny how at the beginning they are so sort of, they're that parents who sort of would never criticize. They don't want to impose. Any time the children sort of say something that is apologetic or what they haven't done or admit to something, they turn it back around and say, no, don't worry, you're too busy. So they've got quite a few children. So they've got an eldest son, Kochi, and who's married to Fumiko, and then is it 4 or 5 other children? So it's, you know, 4 other children, isn't it? So Kaneko is the eldest daughter, Shoji is the second son, who is deceased, but we meet Noriko, who's quite a integral part of the film, I would say, in terms of not being a blood relative, but she's the one who actually sort of treats them with the degree of respect, perhaps, that you would think. And then they actually live, don't they, in the rural town with 2 other, their youngest son and daughter, Kyoko and Kizo. So they come to Tokyo, and it's
Kizo lives in Osaka, doesn't he?
Sorry, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But they come to Tokyo, and it's basically just the time. Most of the film is the time spent in Tokyo, and the way that the relationships between the parents and the children are enacted in terms of what happens, but also a lot of the conversations is alluding to things that's happening, you know, internally, but also things that have happened in the past. So there's a lot that you have to kind of not figure out, but infer from what is going on.
Yeah, it's a film that is deceptively simple, I think, and it's a really wonderful undermining of that almost kind of stereotypical idea of kind of, you know, the repressed Japanese culture, where, like you say, that everything feels kind of apologetic and kind of not unaddressed. But over the course of the film, you know, you really become aware of the family dynamic and the kind of the intergenerational changes and what the parents particularly come to learn about their children, you know, from visiting them. It's a kind of road movie in that sense. You know, you follow them to Tokyo, where they're quickly kind of pushed off, you know, and told to go and
go to the health farm or whatever it is.
Look at the health, the health spa. Under the guise that it's that the kids are looking after. Really, the kids don't want them around. They feel burdened by them. Not necessarily in a kind of overt conscious sense, but in that way that they've got busy lives and they've got their own things, and but it's the accumulation. That's what's so wonderful about the film, is you feel the accumulation of all these slights that the parents kind of suffer, and obviously it builds to a very, very kind of sad and tragic finale, and also the positioning of Noriko as a kind of non-blood relative, and how again you understand family through her role in it, which is shouldn't be an obligation, but she's so invested in these people, and it's a really beautiful film. And it's you can see why it's regarded so well, because it's a very powerful film in its simplicity, I think.
Do you think that when I was watching it, I was thinking where not the blame lies, but what is Ozu saying about the generations and their take on each other, as it were? Because I think that Kaneko, who is the eldest daughter, is definitely the sort of most overt in sort of trying to palm off the parents wherever she can.
She's horrible. She's just a horrible.
Pretty horrendous. But the eldest son, I think, is kind of interesting because he sort of goes along with that a little bit more. Although there is that moment where they're about to go out for a sort of day out, and he's a doctor, so he gets called away, and he's quite quick to want to get called away to go see a patient. But I think it's interesting because I think sometimes this is where you've got to read the cultural differences a little bit, or try to sort of comprehend those, because the eldest son would traditionally be the one who would inherit the wealth, but he would then be charged with looking after the parents, which clearly is not happening. It's the youngest ones who are looking after the parents. And I was reading a little bit about this. It's really interesting how in the post-war era, because obviously the sort of Allied forces were in charge, they changed the tax system quite radically. So you didn't get this passing of all of the wealth and all of the property to the eldest son anymore. They changed made that kind of changed the way that was structured. So it's interesting how that sort of plays into, I think, the way that this family drama is set up. And maybe it's something that would be much more obvious to a Japanese audience, perhaps.
Potentially, yeah. I mean, I kind of read it that, I think Koichi, as the oldest, is an interesting character in the sense, like, he feels like he's got an important role serving the community. The status of that, is shifts in terms of our perception of it throughout the film, really interestingly. And Kyoko is obviously the youngest daughter, still at home, looking after the parents, kind of school teacher. But within the film, it's clear that if she marries, then someone else is going to have to, look after the parents, and kind of take that responsibility. But they just push it down the road. Yeah. And I think they don't really deal with it. And that sense of kind of moving it down the road is obviously what ends up kind of with tragic consequences for the characters and that family. But you see through the parents how that might be a different kind of cultural approach within Japanese culture. Yeah. Compared to what might have been, pre-war or kind of earlier way of dealing with kind of family situations. And they struggle with it. In terms of what you're saying about where the blame lies, I don't think it lies anywhere. I think I think that apart from kind of Shige, who's obviously drawn as a very selfish character. Yeah. But then obviously within, it's unfortunate that it's a female character. But then also, Keizo is equally selfish, but has more of a kind of redemptive moment towards the end where he kind of realizes what, I guess obviously, when you're kind of working it out, you need different characters to have different kind of personalities. But for the most part, they're just living their lives. What I love about it as well is it's clear that the understanding of the city and what goes on in the city feels like a relatively recent phenomenon in the Japan that we see in the film. Like their idea of the city and the reality of their children's lives in the city is kind of, there's a big gap there. And you get the sense, even like particularly Noriko is kind of really struggling to get by, is kind of happy to live in the city and be part of it. But it's not a very glamorous existence. It's a kind of hand to mouth existence. And the way we understand that is through the way that Ozu frames and shoots locations and interiors and kind of his understanding of interior and exterior space, which is absolutely phenomenal. In his career.
Yeah, I'll come on to that in a second. I just I wanted to just think maybe a little bit more about that sense of disappointment, because there's that really great scene where the father goes out and gets pissed with I think he's an old war buddy. And, there's been little sort of implications about being disappointed with the children, but it really comes out in that sequence, doesn't it? What was interesting to me is that idea, and, we talked a little bit before we did this episode about how maybe these universal themes are still being played out all the time. And, particularly in the political and the general social circumstances we've had over the last few years, that idea of what the expectations of children are of their parents and vice versa, because there's that sense of the parents being being a burden, but there's definitely a sort of sense from the parents that there is disappointment of the children. And I'm just, I think one of the great things about the film is actually you could kind of side with the parents or the children, because I think that there's a sense in which, what are the children supposed to do? Yeah, obviously Kaneko is pretty horrendous, but it's like, what is the relationship? How does that develop over time when your parents get old? And what does looking after them mean? And then what are the parents' expectations of the children? You know what I mean? What were they? Is the disappointment merely about the fact that they're not together as a group and they're not being looked after, or is it some sort of sense that that selfishness as people is the disappointment that the parents feel?
And whether it's a disappointment specifically with their children that they come to understand, or whether it's just, that they feel like the world has changed, and it inevitably has, and their children are part of the modern world, and that it's not the world that they necessarily know or understand. And they kind of express their disappointment in terms of, but also say, like, we have too many expectations. They're kind of aware of the reality of the life that the children are leading and have to lead on their own, and they kind of question themselves whether it's fair to even expect your children to live up to a certain expectation. But what you see is they obviously have, from the country and not visiting and not seeing their children, a sense of what those lives are like. And then when they see it, it's a much a disappointment with their way of seeing the world that's changed. But it's manifest in their children, which gives it such poignancy. It's not an abstract. It's not like they go to Tokyo as a kind of break and are just observing the city. They have a conduit which is so tethered, so they understand those changes in such a specific way, and then they pass that on to the audience. Which is one of the, again, and one of the reasons why I think the film is so regarded, as I think, is because of that point of view, that kind of script decision to tell the story through the older generation, kind of visiting rather than the younger generation visiting or being visited upon. It really situates the audience in that perspective. So you see the changes in the world and in their family through their eyes, and that gives it kind of a real poignancy, and feels kind of quietly radical in a way, in terms of giving the space to older characters to be uncomfortable and kind of disappointed and disconnected from their surroundings, without then passing judgment on why that's happened. It doesn't blame the children. It doesn't blame, the world, the war. It's just a kind of observation of, well, the world is changing. And there's like you say, there's a gap between those generations which will never be kind of met now. I think too many things have happened, and the world is too different, which is, a kind of a cumulative power towards the end of the film, which is kind of devastating.
Yeah, and it also sort of really doesn't shy away from that idea that, you just don't have a choice when it comes to your family. And what do you do when there's maybe people in your family you actually do not like, and you wouldn't be giving them the time of day unless they were in your family. And then even sort of from the other perspective, there's that sense of guilt and distance that you feel, at certain times from family members, but the impossibility of bridging that gap, you know what I mean? That sense of, here is this person who is absolutely fundamental to my life, has brought me up, or, is my child, but I really don't have any idea who they are. And it's very, I think there's a lot of that sort of feeds into the repressive notions of family relationships that are very difficult to deal with. And I think it's putting those ideas out there and almost sort of leaving them to percolate in the audience's mind. Like, the film knows that everybody in the audience is sort of experiencing this in one way or another,
Yeah, and like you say, kind of what's your entry point in terms of your relationship in your family and your kind of relationship with other family members. I don't think it's a spoiler to say, we sort of alluded to it there in terms of where the film goes, but Tommy, the mother, kind of dies towards the end of the film, and it's really telling. It was really telling for me in how the children react to that event, and what they do, and how quickly they want to flee to their old life, their existing lives, and not really address what's happened, which I think is really, really interesting in terms of the differences within that family. And just that, again, like the film leaves the weight of it with the father, who is obviously devastated. There's nothing after the death of his wife. So beautiful where, and Koichi as the doctor kind of comes and sort of takes the father outside with Shijie and says, she probably won't last till the morning, and he just sort of says, oh, so she's not going to live, and then he just repeats it, and it's so like this kind of willingness, or this kind of acceptance and facing of the reality.
And then the neighbor comes past the next day and just sort of says, oh, so you're on your own now? And he says, yes. And he says, oh, you're going to be lonely. She says, you're going to be lonely now. He says, yes, I'm going to be lonely now. And it's like there's not even a sort of discussion of that. It's just a fact, and it ties into what you've just said.
And the kids have gone. Koichi's gone, obviously feeling, you get the sense from that performance by the actor that just not addressing it, which is a beautiful irony because he's a doctor and faces death every day. And Shijie's kind of taken what she wants and gone. And the one who stays is Noriko, and she doesn't have to stay, and she stays. And Keizo says he'll stay, and then when he finds out Noriko can stay, he's like, I'll go then. And it's just, life kind of returns to the normal that they all know, but it's a very different kind of normal for all of them. It was what I love about it as well is the sense of what's coming throughout the film. There's a kind of couple of visual moments with the mother. There's a beautiful line where she goes for a walk with her grandson, which kind of again projects this story into the future beyond this generational shift into what's going to come down the line for those children and their children, where she sort of says to the grandson, who's just kind of a few years old and is just sort of playing and ignoring her, kind of, by the time you're a doctor, I wonder where I'll be. She's aware that things are happening for her, but also that the changes that are coming in her family and in the society are kind of rapid, and that what's happening, what she sees in her children is not how it's going to stay. They will have to face the same disappointments, the same readjustment of understanding about what life is at the same point, when this grandchild is of age. And that was just so beautiful in terms of it did in the script what Ozu is just so great at, which is suggesting the universe and the world outside the frame. The longevity of these ideas and these stories feels so embedded in it that you feel like this story will carry on after the film's finished. And he does that in every frame, really, in terms of relocating these characters in a universe and a world which feels so deep through his kind of techniques of filming, I think.
And just in terms of people can read so much about Ozu's style and his shooting practices and the still camera and the pillow shots and just coming back to it now at this point, was there anything that sort of struck you more? I mean, for me, I don't know whether it was to do with the quality of the restoration, which is absolutely brilliant, but it almost seemed to me, that when you get the static framed shots and they're just so beautifully constructed in terms of mise en scène and just in terms of their composition and the symmetry and the way that sort of shapes, there is almost a sort of, they could be formalist paintings if you just used black and white, you know what I mean? Yeah. But what really struck me this time is that how they're kind of like, they seem like tunnels. And I'd never sort of noticed this before, but it's almost kind of like a lot of the way that the shots are established is like we are in a kind of long tunnel here. And I'm just wondering, I really wondered whether that was a sort of effect that he was wanting to go for, or whether it's just, I don't know, whether it's just that effect of trying to see through spaces and along spaces, along different axes. So we're kind of facing the action in a specific kind of way, and that reads alongside the way that he does the reverse shot with the portrait kind of framing. If any of that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. I think there is an intentionality to creating those tunnels. Is a great way of kind of putting it. I think I really like that because the sheer depth of the kind of the action in the image was kind of noticeable this time, but also because we both recently saw the Flavor of Green Tea Over Rice. You know, and again, so just kind of seeing so much work in the last couple of years and kind of recently, you do see how he kind of configures his world, and I feel that there's a real intention to seeing through the space into the space beyond. You know, like there's so much happening in other houses. Like there's a great scene in this where you sort of see someone preparing like tea in another house. Yeah, you know, like in the house next door. It's very, very clearly happening there, and you can't help but feeling like I'm saying that there's this connection between, but also that this is one life in a billion lives, and they all have the same stories and journeys to go through, you know, and they're all living the same lives, and they're kind of oblivious to the same things, and they're aware of the same things, and it kind of creates a realism in terms of these people's lives that is kind of unavoidable and just feels so rich, you know.
It's a bit like Roma in that way. When I watched Roma, I had that feeling of there is a world going on beyond the frame here. This is not a set, even though he's as meticulous in terms of what we see, you know, in the Academy ratio. That it's amazing how it's at the same time completely flat, yet has this incredible depth as you've described.
There's a like that. The tunnel's a good eye because it feels simultaneously kind of contained and claustrophobic in the room that you're in immediately, but there is that sense just off of kind of a limitless field. And it would be dangerous to say that it's kind of unique, but certainly the combination of styles that he puts together across his body of work feels unique to him, you know, in terms of both that framing and the depth and how he puts it all together. You know, you do know when you're watching an Ozu movie. Yeah, he is a filmmaker with a very, very clear signature, and it is down to object placement, object color, mise en scène, the feng shui of how things are put together in the frame is very, very noticeable and very obvious, and creates such a sensory experience from watching his films. And again, when you kind of go back to this idea of auteur, and you put, you know, you're putting him up against Kurosawa, you know, Mitsuguchi is obviously harder to place, I think, but when you look at a Kurosawa movie and you look at an Ozu movie, they have very clear styles, and then when you put them together as kind of symbols of Japanese cinema, and then you put them next to Wells and Hitchcock, you start to actually, you can see that's where the ideas of these filmmakers come from almost reducing these to a kind of a manageable way of assessing, because obviously they are kind of reductive in any sense, because there's obviously much more going on in this film compared to, you know, even later work or very, very early work. There's a kind of an evolution and a change and differences, but ultimately you're reducing it. But I don't always think reducing it is a negative thing. That's why I'm sort of saying it, you know, like I don't think that us kind of saying, well, there is a style and it's this and this is how we feel about it is necessarily reductive, because you want to try and get at that voice, you know, and try and access that voice, which is such an interesting voice in world cinema.
And it's clear that, just to sort of round off on Tokyo Story, the influence is clear, and you can read about directors who talk about, I mean, all the directors in the West, you know, in sort of post-New Wave terms, talk about Ozu. We talked a little bit at the beginning, and maybe we can sort of think about that. How does this to place a film like this in front of an audience who is used to watching, contemporary movies, is this one of the issues that cinema has? And again, maybe in this context right now, it's something that could be addressed, because we're going to have to go back to older movies. That sense that movies do or did or continue to have a style depending on the director that you're talking about, but also on the intention to make a cinematic style overt. You know what I mean? Because I think that in the last 10 or 15 years, I think that there is a sort of rail against that idea of a director being overly directorial. You know what I mean? This person is sort of, Inarritu is one of the ones that's sort of always criticized, I think, for, he's just up his own arse with his camera trickery. I think there's something to be said for that kind of criticism. But on the other hand, here is somebody who is, in Ozu, who has created a kind of lexicon of filmmaking that is more or less all their own. And if somebody tries to do that now, I think it's much more difficult, because we don't have that sense of being allowed to experiment formally in film is much more difficult. And I'm trying to figure out, I'm sure that there are sort of variables as to why, but it's difficult to pin that down, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a big one. I think that a lot of the acceptance of auteurs in terms of cinephiles and even kind of, just general kind of film culture seems to link much more kind of readily the personality to the kind of the filmmaking.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because I think that Inarritu is a great example of, he just comes across as a really obnoxious person, and that without any respect for any collaborators and their involvement, which is historically how auteurs have done it, but that seems to have changed, and there seems to be less tolerance of his auteurism in many senses, But you look at, I'm thinking of someone like Barry Jenkins, who is kind of beloved as a person with a personality. So his filmmaking is kind of regarded more positively in terms of his development of an auteur style and what is the Barry Jenkins style. I'm thinking also last year of something like The Souvenir, which kind of has a lot of Ozu, but Joanne Hogg was a very generous interviewee and a very interesting person. There seems to be a willingness to listen to people talk about or to regard people as auteurs, as long as they're not problematic. Which I think that feels like a shift. But, and I don't know whether that's good or bad, that's a different thing. But that's just my kind of initial response, is like, I think that if we like the people, we're willing to see them as auteurs in it and appreciate their visual style more.
Yeah.
Someone like Nolan as well.
Yeah.
Nolan's kind of tricky, isn't he? Because we don't really know him.
Yeah.
There's an idea of him which kind of almost negates any kind of serious conversation about his filmmaking approach. Maybe
it is because these people are so in the, there's so many public forums for people to be discussed and for them to be visible. But so I think there's something along the lines that it's about that these filmmakers are what they are, and if you don't like what they are, then you're never going to be able to appreciate them. It's almost kind of like, it goes back to the tribalism of popular culture, that if this is your thing, that's great. If it's not your thing, then you're going to lambaste it. Like, if you think of somebody like Tarantino or Wes Anderson, it's like the criticism of those films are be less like Tarantino and Wes Anderson. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't want you to make films like... Everybody knows what a Tarantino, what you're going to get with a Tarantino film, and Wes Anderson the same. And if it's like, oh, why is Wes Anderson so bothered about symmetry, and why does everything have to be... It's like, because he is, you know what I mean? That's his stylistic approach. That's his formalism, and he's not a realist in that sense. So if you come from the position of a film should be reflective of reality in some understanding of that, then you're going to be like, this is just somebody who's fannying around with the dimensions of his camera or something,
Yeah, I think as well they're good examples, because they're which kind of goes back to why there might be a kind of difference, and why those filmmakers that I've just mentioned might be slightly different, is that there's never the sense, or not, it's not discussed very much or considered very much, that Tarantino or Wes Anderson have something to say.
Yeah.
You know, like they are
That's true.
kind of stylists, as opposed to which I don't think is always true of them, but also I don't think it's always true of the old kind of classic works. But there is this idea that there's a kind of a seriousness and a commentary in those works that makes them valid as objects, in a way that referencing other artists for the purpose of kind of creating a stylistic exercise is not serious, because it's not on a marriage of form and content. Now, I don't agree with that, but I definitely hear those arguments, which kind of goes back again to what we're saying about Tokyo Story is a serious film, and it's unavoidably got stuff to say. So it carries a weight of importance in a way that other films maybe don't, and that's I think that's a generational and cultural shift. But also, you know, those films I mentioned, you know, The Souvenir and Barry Jenkins are also arguably films that have something to say from different voices, different perspectives, but certainly engage with a kind of a realism of experience that is being cinematically presented. And I think as well, Ozu was a contemporary of Honda, who I mentioned, you know, but those films would never be taken seriously or considered important. They're just monster movies, B movies, and it takes time to kind of reassess and position. And what I wanted to say right at the start as well about these things is you don't see comedies in these lists.
No.
So I do think that there is a weightiness to it, that if you're not engaging with a serious kind of societal or cultural or kind of human issue, then you're just a kind of a technician or a stylist, which is, and you could never
it's
say.
Because Ozu, I mean, this film was never released immediately in America or in the UK, so it wasn't kind of like, oh no, this is a drop dead masterpiece from the start. I mean, it got its shared through patronage, really, through film festivals and directors calling attention to Ozu. So, you know, it's like that idea of something that's come into itself over time, over reappraisal, and that always as well has a sort of element of who do we want to champion and what are the politics behind that. Not that I know what the politics particularly are, but they are kind of there, aren't they?
That's a good point you make there in terms of, like, you mentioned earlier about, you know, it's showing this to a modern audience. There's thinking that these films, when they released, like you say, were huge blockbusters, but they weren't. You know, they were festival films that were shown in rep houses and the urban intellectual centres that then gained a following, that then kind of had influence. These are not huge blockbuster films. So again, they would probably find a home amongst the same audience now. You couldn't necessarily just take it into a multiplex and say, but that would have been the case in the 50s and 60s as well.
Yeah.
So that's a really good point.
It does relate to that question, you know, at the beginning, where when we're talking about films, we sort of conflate these ideas of best with personal favourite, and again with, is this the representation of what this filmmaker kind of stood for as an artist? And we conflate those three kind of ideas at times. I mean, I wouldn't go, if somebody said to me, where should you start with Ozu? I'd probably say, well, you know, his most famous film is Tokyo Story, but, you know, late spring or early summer or Green Tea Over Rice was just really nice to watch, wasn't it? You know what I mean? It wasn't sort of portentous and yeah, I mean, rigid. You described it, and I think that in some ways that is very, very true. But again, its rigidity is expecting you to find the cracks in that edifice of rigidity, if we're using those allegories or metaphors.
No, I think Tokyo Story is about rigidity as much as
it is.
Yeah, so it's formally constructed in order to make that point, and it does it really, really well.
Yeah, and of course, the universal themes are things that are picked up all the time. I mean, we both watched this film. I know it's not a Japanese film, and again, I don't want to conflate Asianness in any sort of reductive way. But this film that was based on the podcast from This American Life called The Farewell was really interesting in sort of that sense of what the family responsibilities are. So this is a story that follows a Chinese American family who learn the grandmother has only got a short while to live, and they decide that they're not going to give her this information, and then the granddaughter comes back from America and is really torn about, because she's brought up in the Western scientific culture and feels like that she should have this information, but the rest of the family are prohibiting her from giving the grandmother the truth.
Yeah, and hopefully people will see that we're not doing that in a kind of reductive, it's, Japan and China are the same, but certainly it felt like an interesting counterpoint as a modern retelling of that story of the kind of intergenerational change and shift, with the added layer in the farewell of, obviously, like you say, it's not just the granddaughter who's Americanized by kind of being born and growing up there, or kind of growing up there because she's born in China and leaves when they're very young, but that her parents
are as well,
become Americanized and kind of American citizens, and they are kind of caught even more in between the Chinese way of doing things and the American way of doing things. And it's more of an overt comedy in places, but certainly kind of intriguing tale about kind of the role of children, grandchildren, and parents and grandparents in how a family operates, particularly around the really serious and the kind of the end of life stuff, which is, it's a really great cinematic device to kind of bring people together in that way. But also it's one of those events that unifies a family, even if it's just temporarily, and in terms of geography, estranged members kind of come back together. And I think in the film, both the matriarch's sons live in America, but neither of them have been back together in China for 25 years. So there's this wonderful moment where you realize, obviously, that they have their own individual understandings of China and their homeland, but that's changed again when they're back together, because the family dynamic is different when they're in America without being in that structure with the matriarch at the top. It's really, really clever, and really fascinating. And like Tokyo Story, it doesn't really come to a conclusion about whether the old way is good or the new way is good, or whether the Chinese way is good or whether the American way is good. It feels like these are questions that are too big to answer in anything, let alone a film. But it's kind of just engaging with those. And I really love the ending of The Farewell. I just thought it could have gone down a very traditional resolution, but it doesn't, because it felt much more kind of messy, like the Tokyo Story ending, like much more closer to real life, where we just kind of go back and we don't really know anything else. We've just had that experience and try and learn from it. And it also a reminder that these universal themes of family and how you exist in a family, and your role in a family, and how you maintain those bonds are universal and kind of timeless. And as long as there will be families, there'll always be the need to greater understand how families work.
And it's so interesting about these films as well. I mean, again, maybe it's the counterpoint to the way that the drama of the family is sort of perceived in the West. If you're not shouting at each other and throwing each other out and all of that kind of stuff, and there's not sort of, the action isn't coalesced around particular incidents or particular antagonisms that are on the surface and can be seen. That doesn't happen in these films. It is all about that sense of what's behind the surface in terms of, and if you think about my family and you think about the way that the interactions take place, 99% of it is the stuff that's unsaid, and it allows you a much more sophisticated relationship between yourself and the film. I mean, I guess that's my own sort of predilections for when stuff gets explained to me too much in movies. I could have figured that out, or no, I wanted to have my own sort of viewpoint on that. And I think that's one of the for both of these films, I think it's a really clever way of dealing with what is one of the key elements of the way that families both have to function, because you have to repress a lot, but also it's their underlying problem, isn't it? It's the underlying tension.
Yeah, and both are kind of cinematic in that understanding of the accumulation of images and moments. Like you say, there's lots of little moments where gestures and the odd phrase is left hanging in the air, but about how they build to a bigger picture of the family dynamic is really well handled, so that by the end you've got a sense of the dynamic of those families and how there are historical ways of being that have led to an inevitability which you don't understand till you get there and you've seen how these people live their lives amongst each other. And it's really moving in that sense of both a kind of a sadness, like, which is just a sadness is very human, which is, a lot of the time the biggest problem we have is that we can't communicate properly with each other, or we don't, or we let too much time pass. And that's relevant in every area of our life, not just immediate family, but friendships and relationships, and it's a truth that never kind of gets old if it's retold in kind of these ways. I thought as well, I think what's important to, just to kind of go back as well, which I just thought about this, but I think it's important to talk about the farewell in this context, is because this is a modern film with a modern, young rising star, Awkwafina, in the lead, very popular amongst the younger generation, and myself. I think she's fantastic in the film. But if you want people to go back, it's important to say, actually, the farewell, if you like the farewell and you're interested in this kind of really quiet and honest depiction of family, then try Ozu. It's kind of, it's trying to use and seeing those parallels, which are not, I don't think there's anything really formally the same, and culturally not really the same, but they feel tonally similar to how they're trying to tell this intergenerational story. And you want people to then kind of seek out other work. How do you get kids into Ozu? Well, the farewell might be a way of doing that. Seeing those links which are thematic, I think it is important to do, rather than saying, well, they're kind of old, and if you like new films, you won't like old films, which I think is kind of not giving people credit. Sometimes they just need that roadmap.
Yep, indeed. So that just about wraps it up for our season 11. Neil, any I dread to say highlights from this year, but because it's been it's been what it's been. But I've been thinking about it over the last sort of week or so, and an interesting season in terms of, I think that we have gone, apart from this episode, we have gone as diverse as we possibly could in terms of the films that we've looked at and the approaches to the episodes. Yeah,
I think that is definitely that would definitely be a highlight for me as well, in terms of like the increasing scope and engagement that comes with that of the podcast. It's been almost, I mean, it's weird because a lot of these were planned kind of pre-COVID. So obviously, we've talked about this, in terms of wanting to really kind of try and extend the types of episodes and the types of content, the types of guests, and that we've got, and it seems to have really kind of come to fruition of late. It felt like a season where we were kind of really starting to do what we've recently realised is what we want to do, which is be as diverse as possible. And I know that we both have further ambitions in that field, particularly in terms of shifts in the culture. That kind of, if you've read our newsletter, you'll sort of be aware of our kind of approach to that. But certainly in terms of Black and Indigenous and people of colour cinema, definitely need some. I think that's an area where we can do more work. But I feel like we're on that road, and this feels like a good season to encapsulate where we are now. And the Berlin trip takes on an extra poignancy.
I was going to mention that,
because I don't know when we're going to do that again ever. Be in the same room recording at a film festival there. Like it's
a planet away, isn't it? God, it
is. Yeah, it is. And also, I just wanted to mention that the Mark Cousins episode, just because it's always great to have Mark Cousins on, but just kind of having the situation and the fact that we were recording it online, which we've done a lot, but understanding actually the only way we can do it is online, so let's all do it together kind of thing, was a kind of nice episode, and that was really enjoyable to make that work. Was nice. So it's been a good season, I think, and I'm excited about the next one.
Definitely so. And I think just on that final note there, the sense of maybe doing a bit more formal experimentation, maybe a little bit of video here and there, utilizing the YouTube channel. And I've definitely got sort of ideas about again, another sort of how should I put it, sort of essayistic type of episode, a la The Voice or Knowing Sounds. We'll definitely is something that I'm thinking about for next.
Was the voice this season?
It
season,
was, yeah.
God, yeah. I mean, that was amazing as well. Yeah.
So
that feels like a planet away as well.
Yeah, it does actually. But I mean, the thing with that was, again, it's the organised. That was a year in the making. That one, just getting everybody's work together, and then sort of 3 months editing bit by bit. So, but definitely something of that ilk moving forward. But great to spend the season with you, Neil.
As always, yeah, pleasure.
And we will be back in late September, early October, most likely. We thank you for sticking with us. If you want to support the podcast a little bit more, we have the Patreon site where you can read our newsletters and get any of our further bonus content. But until the autumn, thank you very much for listening. This has been the Cinematologist Podcast.
It's humble and fine. They are beautiful. On the hilltops at night, they are beautiful. And blazing with light is the widest and the tallest and